There are houses that hold grief the way a well holds cold water, quiet, dark, and deeper than they look. The Row place was one of those. I'd worked that ranch 31 years, long enough to watch a man bury a wife, a boy turn to stone before he was old enough to shave, and a little girl stop speaking altogether. I'd seen the curtains drawn at noon. I'd seen a father set a plate for someone who wasn't coming back, then carry it out to the dogs without a word. So when the stage dropped a stranger at the foot of the lane one September evening, a young woman in a town dress with mud already climbing her hem, a single carpet bag, and a letter she held like it might catch fire, I figured she'd be gone by Sunday. I was wrong about almost everything that came after. What I'm going to tell you isn't a tidy story. There's no part of it that goes the way you'd expect. A widower who didn't want her, children who wouldn't have her, a winter that nearly took all of them, and one young woman, no older than the century, who walked into a house full of ghosts and refused, gently, stubbornly, day after impossible day, to leave it the way she found it. I kept a ledger most of my life. Numbers mostly. Head of cattle, sacks of feed, the date of the first frost. But somewhere in there I started writing down the other things too, because I knew nobody would believe them later. The rain came sideways the evening she arrived, the kind that doesn't fall so much as get thrown, and I remember thinking nobody with sense would stand out in it the way she did. But she did stand in it. At the end of the lane, by the broken gatepost we never got around to fixing, holding her bag against her chest with both arms like a child holds a doll it's been told to give up. The wind took the brim of her bonnet and folded it flat against her face, and she didn't even lift a hand to fix it. Just stood there looking up the rise at the house, at the one window with a lamp in it, working up to something. I was in the barn doorway with a busted hinge in my hand, and 40 years of weather in my knees, and I watched her a good long minute before I did the decent thing and walked down. "You lost," I called over the rain. She turned, young, younger than I'd guessed from the silhouette, wet through and trying hard not to shiver and failing. She had a face that hadn't yet learned to hide what it felt, which out here is either a blessing or a death sentence, depending. "Is this the Row place?" she said. "Mr. Caleb Row." Now I'll be honest. My first thought was that she was kin come for the funeral 2 years late. My second thought, when she pulled that letter out from under her shawl, half pulped by the wet, was uglier and closer to the truth. "He sent for you," I said. "It wasn't a question." She nodded, water ran off her chin. "He know you're coming today." And that's when her face did the thing I'd remember later, a small flinch, quick as a bird, that she covered by lifting her chin. "He knows I'm coming," she said, which I noticed was not the same as today. Her name was Eliza Pratt. She was 22 years old, from a town in Ohio I'd never heard of and couldn't spell, and she had answered an advertisement. Or rather, she'd answered a letter, a private one, that Caleb Row had written in February when the nights were longest, and the whiskey was nearest, and he was, by his own admission much later, not in his right mind. He'd written it, he'd mailed it, and then he'd done what Caleb did with everything that frightened him, which was to bury it so deep he half convinced himself it never happened. So when I walked Eliza Pratt up that muddy rise and pushed open the door of the house, and Caleb turned from the stove with his sleeves rolled and his face gone slack, I understood right away that we had a problem. "Caleb," I said, "you got company." I have never in my life seen a man's color drain so fast. He looked at her, and then at the letter in her hand, recognized his own writing on it, I think, even across the room, and something went across his face that I can only describe as a door slamming. He set down the spoon. He wiped his hands on a rag, slow, like he was buying time with the motion. "Miss Pratt," he said, flat, careful, "there's been a misunderstanding." She didn't move. The rain dripped off her onto his clean floor. "You wrote to me," she said quietly. "You said you had 2 children and no one to mother them. You said you'd pay my passage. You said," and here her voice caught just for a half-second before she pressed on. "You said I'd have a home." "That was a long time ago." "It was 4 months ago, Mr. Rowe." The silence after that was the kind you could hang a coat on. "I'll tell you about the children, because they were in that room, and you should know they heard every word." Tom was 15, tall for it, hard for it, with his mother's dark hair and his father's habit of going quiet when he was hurt instead of loud. He'd been doing a man's work on that ranch since he was 13, since the morning we found Hannah cold beside the well, and it had aged him in a way that had nothing to do with years. He stood by the table with a coil of rope he'd been mending, and he looked at Eliza Pratt the way you'd look at a wolf that had wandered into the yard. Not afraid. Just calculating the distance to the rifle. And then there was the girl, Della, 7 years old that fall. She sat under the table a lot in those days, in the dark cave of the tablecloth, with her knees pulled up and her arms around them, watching the stranger's wet hem with eyes too big for her face. Della hadn't spoken a word in 22 months. Not since the morning. The doctor had a long name for it, I had a shorter one. The child had stood at her mother's funeral and opened her mouth to say goodbye, and nothing had come out, and nothing had come out since. She'd point, she'd tug a sleeve, she'd nod or shake her head. But the voice that used to fill that house with questions, why is the sky, where do the geese go, can I name the new calf, that voice had gone down into the cold water with everything else, and we had all of us in our way stopped expecting it back. Eliza Pratt did not know any of this. She only knew she'd crossed half a country on the strength of a stranger's lonely night, and that the stranger was now telling her to leave. "You'll stay the night," Caleb said finally, in the voice he used for fence repairs and weather. "I'll make up the back room. In the morning I'll drive you to town and pay your fare home, and we'll call it square." It wasn't square. We both knew it wasn't square. You don't pull a young woman out of her whole life with a letter and then call a wagon ride square. But that was Caleb. Close every wound with the nearest available bandage and hope nobody looks too long. Eliza looked at him a long moment. Then she looked down at the floor, I thought. At her own ruined shoes, but she wasn't looking at the floor. She was looking under the table. She crouched, right there in her soaked dress on his clean planks. She went down to her heels so she was eye to eye with the dark. "Hello," she said, soft, like the rest of the room wasn't there. "I'm Eliza. I came an awful long way and I'm cold as a creek stone. I don't suppose you know if there's anything warm in that pot." Della didn't answer, of course. Della never answered. But I watched that child's eyes move from the stranger's face to the stove and back, and something in the set of her small shoulders eased by the width of a hair. Not trust. Nowhere near trust. Just the first crack of attention in a face that had been shut for nearly 2 years. Eliza saw it too. She didn't make a thing of it. That was the first wise thing I saw her do, and there'd be 100 more. She just stood back up, brushed off her knees, and said to Caleb, perfectly level, "I'll have the soup if it's offered. And the back room. Thank you." She stayed the night. In the morning the rain hadn't stopped. The river road was a swamp, and the wagon couldn't get through. She stayed the next night too. And the night after that the fever came for Della. I have buried people I loved in this country, and I'll tell you the worst part of a child's fever isn't the heat of it. It's the helplessness. It's standing in a house 30 miles from the nearest doctor watching a small body burn and shake, and knowing that everything you can do might not be enough, and that the last time it wasn't enough, you put a woman in the ground by the well. Caleb went somewhere behind his own eyes that night. I'd seen it before. He sat by the bed and held the child's hand, and his face was the face of a man already grieving, already bracing, already half gone to the worst of it before the worst had even come. Because once you've lost like Caleb had lost, you stop believing in any other ending. It was Eliza who didn't believe in it. "She's not dying," Eliza said, not gently, sharp, even. She'd taken off her town dress and worked in her shift with her sleeves shoved up, and her hair had come down, and she looked nothing like the careful girl off the stage. "Mr. Rowe, look at me. She is hot and she is sick and she is not dying, and I need you to stop sitting there burying her and bring me cool water and the strongest vinegar in this house." He looked at her like she'd struck him. "Now," she said. And I don't fully know why, to this day, he went. She worked over that child the whole night and into the next day. Cool cloths, vinegar to break the heat, willow bark steeped weak when the chills came. She talked the entire time, a low, steady stream, nonsense and stories and the names of flowers, never once stopping, as though the sound itself were a rope she was throwing down into the dark for the girl to climb. When her own voice cracked, she drank water and kept on. When Caleb tried to spell her, she shook her head. "She knows your fear, she'll feel it." And he, who answered to no one, sat down again like a scolded boy. Tom watched from the doorway most of that night, arms crossed, stone-faced, but he watched. Near dawn of the second day, the fever broke. It broke all at once the way they do, the heat just pouring off the child in a sweat, and Della opened her eyes, clear, exhausted, hers again, and looked up at the stranger leaning over her. And Eliza Pratt, who had not slept in 30 hours, smiled down at her like the sun coming up and said, "There you are. There you are, little bird. I knew you were in there." And Della Rowe, 7 years old, who had not made a sound in 22 months, opened her cracked lips and whispered one word. "Mama." Nobody breathed. Eliza's face, I was watching her face, Eliza's face went through about 4 things in the space of a second. Joy. Then heartbreak, because of course she knew what that word cost and who it was meant for. And then something steadier than both, something I didn't have a name for yet but would come to understand was just the shape of who she was. "No, sweetheart," she said softly, and she smoothed the wet hair off the child's forehead. "No, I'm not your mama. Your mama loved you so much. I'm Eliza, but I'm here. I'm right here." Della looked at her, a long moment with those big eyes. Then she said, in a small, rusty voice that hadn't been used in nearly 2 years, "I'm thirsty." I had to leave the room. A grown man, foreman of that ranch, and I had to walk out into the gray morning and stand by the barn and not be seen for a while. When I came back in, Caleb Rowe was standing in the corner with his hand over his mouth and tears on his face he wasn't bothering to hide anymore, and he looked at Eliza Pratt across that bed, the woman he'd been planning to send home in a wagon, and he didn't say anything. You'd think that would be the turn of it. The fever broke, the child spoke, the door opened. You'd think the rest would be easy. It wasn't. It was the hardest stretch of all, and I'll tell you why. A house can grieve, but it can also get used to grieving. It can build its whole shape around the missing thing the way a tree grows around a fence wire, until you can't tell anymore where the wood ends and the wound begins. The Rowe house had grown around Hannah's absence for 2 years, and here was this young woman with her sleeves rolled up, gently, and then not so gently, pulling at the wire. Della came back first and easiest. Children are like new grass that way. Give them a little sun and they'll find their way up through anything. Within a month she was chattering again, following Eliza around the kitchen, nomming the new calves the way she used to, asking her endless, impossible questions. Why is the sky? Where do the geese go? Eliza answered every one of them like it was the most important question ever asked, and if she didn't know, she'd say so. "I don't know, bird, let's find out." Which I came to learn was rarer and more precious than knowing. Time was the wall. That boy had decided, somewhere in the cold of those 2 years, that loving anything was a debt that came due in grief, and he had resolved not to take on any more of it. He was civil to Eliza the way you're civil to a stranger at a funeral. He ate what she cooked but wouldn't praise it. He did his work and hers when she asked, but he wouldn't meet her eye. And once early on, when she tried to move something of Hannah's, just a chipped blue cup, just to wash it, he came across the kitchen so fast I thought he'd strike her. "That's hers," he said, his voice shook. "You don't touch hers." Eliza set the cup down, very carefully, right back where it had been. "You're right," she said. "I'm sorry, it's hers." And she left it there, that chipped blue cup, on the shelf where Hannah had left it for the better part of a year. Never touched it, worked around it. Dusted everything else and left a careful ring of dust around that one cup like it was holy ground. Which, to that boy, it was. That was the thing about her I came to respect more than anything. She never once tried to replace the dead woman. A lesser person would have. A lesser person would have come into that house and started making it theirs, moving the furniture, taking down the dress that still hung on the back of the bedroom door, scrubbing the place clean of a ghost to make room for the living. And it would have failed, and the family would have hated her for it, and rightly. Eliza did the opposite. She made room for the ghost. She left the cup. She left the dress. When Della wanted to talk about her mother, Eliza sat down and listened for an hour. When Tom snapped at her, she didn't snap back. She just held steady, like a fence post in wind, and let him blow himself out against her. Caleb was the hardest of all, and for the strangest reason. He was falling for her. Anybody with eyes could see it, slow and against his will, the way a frozen river thaws from underneath where you can't watch it happen. And every inch he fell, he hated himself for it, because in his mind loving Eliza meant being done with Hannah, and being done with Hannah felt like killing her twice. So he held her off. He was kind to her in a careful, locked-up way, and then he'd catch himself being kind and go cold for a week. He'd talk with her late by the fire, easy as old friends, and then not look at her for 3 days. It was cruel, though he never meant it cruel. It was just a man at war with his own heart, and a young woman caught in the crossfire of it, far from home, with no claim on any of them but the one she'd made with her own 2 hands. I asked her once, October, I think. She was out by the wash line in the cold, and I'd come to bring in wood, and I said plain, because I'm an old man and I'd earned the right, "Why do you stay, girl? He won't have you proper, and the boy hates you, and there's nothing holding you here. Town's 3 days off. You could go home." She was quiet a while, pinning up Caleb's shirts in the wind. "Home," she said finally, "is a word, Eli. I had a father who drank and a mother who died of it, and a town that looked the other way. When that letter came," she almost laughed, "a stranger's lonely letter that he never even meant to send, it was the first time in my life anybody told me I was wanted somewhere. Even if it was a mistake, even if he took it back the minute I knocked." She pinned another shirt. "I came 2,000 miles on a mistake," she said. "But that little girl said my name before she said anybody else's. That has to count for something. I'm not leaving people who need me just because they haven't figured out yet that they do." I didn't have an answer for that. I went and brought in the wood. The heavy decision came in November, and it nearly broke her. We'd had a bad season, drought through the summer, then early hard frost, and Caleb was short on the note he owed the bank in town. Short bad. Lose the ranch bad. He didn't tell the children, but he told me, because somebody had to ride to town and beg the banker for time, and beggars travel best in pairs. What he didn't know was that Eliza had heard. She'd heard him packing at night, heard the numbers he muttered, and one morning she came to me with her carpet bag, the same one she'd arrived with, and inside it, wrapped in cloth, was a locket. Gold. Real gold, with a tiny portrait inside of a young woman who had Eliza's exact eyes. "My mother's," she said. "It's the only thing of hers I've got. It's worth enough in town to cover what he's short, maybe more." I just looked at her. "He can't know it was me," she said. "He'll never take it if he knows. You tell him you sold something, tell him it was an old saddle, tell him anything, but you save this ranch, Eli. Those children have already lost one home." Her voice didn't shake, that's what got me. It didn't shake at all. "They are not losing another." I want you to understand what she was giving up. Not the gold. The gold was nothing. She was giving up the last picture of her own dead mother, the only face she had left of the woman who'd loved her, to save a man who wouldn't marry her, and a boy who couldn't stand her, and a ranch that wasn't hers and never might be. I argued with her. I'm not proud of all I said. but she just folded my hand around that locket and closed my fingers over it and said, "Some things you don't do because they're owed. You do them because of who you'd be if you didn't." I rode to town. I sold the locket. I told Caleb it was an old saddle and some tack I'd been meaning to clear out. He believed me because he wanted to. The ranch was saved. And Eliza Pratt went on washing his shirts in the cold, like she hadn't just bought every one of us another year. I kept the secret a long time, longer than I should have. But secrets in a small house are like water in a cellar. Sooner or later, they find the low place and come up through the floor. The blizzard came the second week of December, and it came the way death comes to the old and the foolish out here, without much warning and with no mercy at all. I'd seen bad ones. This was worse. The sky went the color of a bruise by noon, and by dark you couldn't see the barn from the house, 10 paces off, and the wind didn't howl so much as scream, a single long note that got into your teeth and your dreams and didn't stop for 3 days. Caleb was caught out in it. He'd ridden to the far pasture that morning to bring in the last of the cattle before the storm, the way any rancher would, and he'd misjudged it the way any man can. And when the dark came down and he hadn't, we all knew. Tom wanted to ride out after him. I held the boy back by the collar of his coat, both of us shouting over the wind in the doorway, because riding into that white nothing was just a slower way to die, and I'd be cursed before I lost the both of them. It was the longest night of my life, and I've had some long ones. We kept the lamps in the windows, all of them. Every lamp in the house, lit and set in the glass, though you couldn't have seen them from the gate. Eliza's idea. "He'll know which way is home," she said, "if there's light. A man can crawl toward light." She kept the fire roaring and water hot, and she sat with the children through the worst of it, telling them stories I think she was making up as she went, her voice steady as a heartbeat while the house shook around us. He didn't come in the night. Near dawn the wind dropped, that false calm in the eye of those big storms, and before any of us could stop her, Eliza was into her coat and Caleb's spare boots and out the door with a lantern. I went after her. So did Tom, and we found her not 50 yards from the house, on her knees in a drift, dragging at something dark and half-buried. It was Caleb. His horse had gone down somewhere in the night, and he'd crawled, God knows how, blind and freezing. He'd crawled toward the light in the windows just like she'd said, and he'd made it within a stone's throw of his own door before his body gave out. Another hour and the cold would have had him. We'd have found him in the spring thaw, the way we found things. But she'd put the lamps in the windows. We got him inside. He was bad, frostbit, half-frozen, raving, and for 2 days it was the fever all over again, except this time it was Eliza working over the father the way she'd worked over the child. The same low, steady voice, the same refusal to let go, while the wind screamed outside and Tom and Della and I did whatever she told us to. And it was there, in the worst of it, that the secret came up through the floor. Caleb was out of his head with the fever, and he was talking, the way they do, to Hannah, mostly long broken conversations with his dead wife, apologies and accountings, and once, terribly, a goodbye. And Eliza sat through every word of it, held the hand of a delirious man pouring out his love for another woman, and never flinched, and never let go. But there was a moment near the end of it, the fever cresting, when he came halfway up out of the dark and looked at her, really looked, and didn't know what year it was, and said, "Hannah, the note, the bank note Eli sold the tack, were square." And Eliza said, soft, thinking he wouldn't remember, "It wasn't the tack, Caleb, rest now." He went under again. But Tom heard it. The boy looked at her and then at me, and I saw the question land. And because I am old and tired and was done with carrying it, I told him, right there, the whole of it, the locket, his mother's no, her mother's portrait, the only face she had left, sold in town to save his father's ranch, with instructions to never let any of them know. Tom didn't say anything for a long time. Then that boy, that stone wall of a boy, crossed the room to where Eliza sat exhausted by his father's bed, and he stood over her, and his face was working in a way I hadn't seen since the morning by the well. And he reached up to the shelf, and he took down the chipped blue cup, his mother's cup, the one thing in that house no living hand had touched in 2 years, the holy ground, the line he'd nearly struck her for crossing. He put it in her hands. "It was hers," he said, and his voice broke clean in half. "I want it to be yours. I have seen men die, and I have seen men born, and I have never seen anything like the look on that young woman's face when a grieving boy gave her his dead mother's cup. She didn't say a word. She couldn't. She just pulled him down and held him, this great half-grown boy folding up small as Della in her arms, and the two of them shook together, and the storm went on outside, and the father breathed and breathed and breathed. Caleb lived. He came back to himself slow over a week, weak as a kitten and twice as ornery about it. And when he was strong enough to understand, they told him, Tom told him, not Eliza, about the locket, about the lie I'd told, about the face she'd sold to keep his name on his own land. He didn't say much. Caleb never did. But the next time he was strong enough to ride, he was gone 2 days to town and came back with something in his coat, and he found Eliza at the wash line in the cold where I'd found her that October, and he stood there a while not knowing how to start, the way that man never knew how to start. He'd gone and bought the locket back, tracked it down, paid more than he had to, brought it home. He held it out to her in his big chapped hand. "I can't give you her face back," he said. "I know whose was in it. I'm sorry it's empty." A long pause, the wind. "But I thought maybe you might want to put a new one in. Someday." And he stopped because he was Caleb and the words for it were the hardest words there are. "Of us," Eliza said. He nodded, couldn't speak, just nodded. She took the locket. She looked at it a long moment, that empty gold oval where her mother used to be. "Someday," she said. "That's most of it. That's the part I can tell straight." They married in the spring, by the way, when the road opened, and the parson could get through, a small thing with the cattle for witnesses, and Della throwing the last of the dried flowers from the autumn before. But that's not the part I think about. The part I think about is later, years later. I was an old man by then, older than I am even now, telling it, and I'd come up to the house one evening and stopped at the window the way you do and looked in before I knocked. There was a lamp in the window. There was always a lamp in that window after the storm, every night of her life. She never once let it go dark, in case somebody out there was crawling toward home. And in the warm of it I could see them. Caleb gray at the temples and easy in a way he hadn't been in 20 years. Tom grown and broad with a young wife of his own beside him. Della near grown herself, reading aloud to a couple of small ones I won't go into here. And Eliza in the middle of all of it, in a chair by the fire, older, lined, laughing at something. Laughing the way she'd laughed over a fevered child the morning the girl first spoke, like the sun coming up.